Hello and welcome to the Transparency Lab. I'm Dr. Tammie Foster, a behavioural scientist and public health researcher. I'm fascinated by how science is translated into policy and how sometimes the way we collect and interpret evidence can shape the policies that shape our lives. In each episode, I'll take a topic where science and society intersect, sometimes uneasily, and look at how evidence is built, used and debated. So today we're starting with a topic that's both familiar and surprisingly complex: water fluoridation. Water fluoridation has been one of the most enduring public health measures in Australia and around the world. It's credited with reducing tooth decay, especially in children, but it has also been one of the most contested, sparking decades of public debate about potential side effects, ethics and government transparency. In 2017, Australia's National Health and Medical Research Council, the NHMRC, released an updated statement declaring that community water fluoridation was safe and effective. That statement was based on a set of systematic reviews conducted by the NHMRC's Clinical Trials Centre at the University of Sydney. These reviews were intended to provide the most rigorous, up-to-date synthesis of evidence on both the dental and broader health effects of water fluoridation. These broader health outcomes were far from trivial, including conditions such as neurocognitive and developmental disorders, dementia, thyroid dysfunction, skeletal fluorosis, various cancers, and all-cause mortality. But when I read the technical report behind that statement, something caught my attention. Actually, several things did. The methods didn't fully align with international best practice standards for systematic reviews, even though the review team was supposedly Cochrane-trained specialists. And that matters because these reviews directly inform public health policy. So I decided to dig a little deeper. My recent paper, which you can find on preprints.org, is titled Uncovering Methodological Gaps in NHMRC Systematic Reviews on Water Fluoridation. I've attempted to publish this work twice so far, in the Journal of Public Health and the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. Both submissions were rejected, with relatively surface-level feedback, comments about scope or that it wasn't appropriate for an international journal, which was puzzling given that water fluoridation policies exist around much of the world. There was no feedback on the quality or validity of my comparative analysis itself. I did, however, receive helpful feedback from a librarian regarding database documentation and search syntax, which I'll be incorporating into the next version. So apologies if there are any librarians out there that can find some errors in the detail I've provided. I've also approached media outlets such as The Conversation and The Guardian. They described it as interesting work, but again said it didn't quite fit their editorial scope. Despite that, the preprint has had over 120 downloads, and I've received encouraging feedback from researchers and members of the public in New Zealand where similar concerns have been raised about their own national policies. So here I am, sharing these findings directly with you through the Transparency Lab, while I prepare for a third journal submission. My goal isn't to take sides for or against fluoridation. It's to evaluate how the evidence was gathered, assessed, and reported, and to compare that with the gold standard guidelines from Cochrane and Prisma. Think of it as a health policy meta-audit, a review of the review. So what did I find? The first major issue was inconsistency. The review team ran two separate searches, one for dental caries and another for broader health effects. So the problem? They weren't conducted at the same time or with the same level of rigour. The dental search was more comprehensive and was updated a year later, in 2015, while the broader health effects search stopped in 2014, nearly 12 months apart. That means any new studies on fluoride's potential health impacts published during that gap weren't included. There were also small but important inconsistencies in the search syntax. For example, the use of quotation marks, Boolean operators, or truncation symbols varied between searches. To a layperson, that might sound trivial, but in databases like MBAS or PsycInfo, even minor differences in syntax can change which studies are retrieved and ultimately what conclusions are drawn. The result? A stronger evidence base for dental benefits and a much thinner one for possible health risks. The second issue involved how studies were chosen. For health effects, 69 studies were excluded purely because they weren't in English, compared with only 9 exclusions for the dental caries review. Yet the Cochrane Handbook explicitly advises against restricting by language because it can introduce bias. I understand that many researchers limit searches to English language papers for practical reasons. Translating studies can be time-consuming, expensive, and sometimes the original data aren't easily verifiable. But when a review underpins a major national health policy, and given how many non-English papers appeared in the search results, the extra effort to translate and assess the evidence would have been worth it. Even if only a handful contain relevant findings, they could meaningfully shift how the total evidence base is interpreted. Other studies were excluded for vague reasons, such as wrong outcome or wrong publication type, without clear definitions. Some were even removed for not using multivariate analysis, even though that wasn't listed as a requirement in the review protocol. When these decisions aren't transparent, it's difficult for other scientists or the public to understand how evidence was weighed or whether key data may have been overlooked. Another finding that stood out was the lack of differentiation between chemical compounds. The NHMRC review treated all fluoride sources as essentially the same, whether naturally occurring sodium fluoride in groundwater or fluorosilicic acid added during community water treatment. Chemically, these sources are quite different. The acid most commonly added to water supplies, fluorosilicic acid, is produced as a byproduct of phosphate fertilizer manufacturing. Because it undergoes minimal refining, some analyses have found that certain batches of this compound can contain trace contaminants such as arsenic. Studies have shown that even small increases in arsenic, as little as 0.1 to 0.4 parts per billion, can occur when fluorosilicic acid is used compared with pharmaceutical-grade sodium fluoride. Yet the NHMRC review treated all fluoride exposure as equivalent, effectively comparing apples and oranges. That limits how accurately potential health effects can be assessed. The review also grouped participants into broad age bands. So it's recommended that infants, children, adolescents, adults, and older adults. That sounds fine, right? But the adult category covered everyone aged 18 to 64, almost half a century of life bundled into one data line. Cochrane guidelines recommend narrower ranges because long-term exposure matters. A 25-year-old and a 6-year-old don't share the same risk profile for cumulative fluoride intake. Without finer distinctions, effects that emerge only after decades of exposure could easily be missed. The NHMRC report noted that references were managed using reference manager software, but didn't specify which one. It may sound minor, but transparency about tools and processes is essential. Using recognised platforms such as Covidence or JBI Summary, as Cochrane recommends, enables replication and accountability. Without that detail, it's harder to verify how studies were screened, excluded, or double-checked. Perhaps most concerning was the choice of quality assessment tool. Despite involving Cochrane-trained reviewers, the team didn't use Cochrane's own risk of bias framework. Instead, they used a generic tool developed by the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE. That instrument works well for certain clinical trials, but isn't tailored to ecological studies, the type comparing fluoridated and non-fluoridated populations. By ranking ecological studies as lower quality evidence, the review may have unintentionally downplayed research that's highly relevant for population-wide policies. Another issue was timing. Ethical review, including questions of informed consent and fairness, wasn't integrated into the systematic review process itself. The University of Sydney team focused solely on technical evidence. Only after that process finished did the NHMRC Australian Health Ethics Committee evaluate ethical concerns and approve the final statement. That separation meant ethical questions like whether all groups were equally represented or whether potential harms were weighed against benefits couldn't influence how the evidence was collected or interpreted. Essentially, ethics came after the fact, not alongside it. And for a policy that affects nearly every household, that's a significant procedural gap. So when government commission reviews form the basis for national health policy, even small methodological choices can have large consequences. If certain data are omitted or weighed differently, we risk drawing conclusions that look solid, but rest on incomplete foundations. This isn't about discrediting fluoridation, it's about strengthening trust in the science that supports it. Transparency, consistency, and independence are non-negotiable if we want public confidence in evidence-based policy. My review concludes that Australia would benefit from an independent inquiry, potentially at the level of a Royal Commission, into the methodologies and evidence used to justify water fluoridation policy. Such a body could examine not only health outcomes, which are broad and significant, but also the governance structures that determine what counts as acceptable evidence. The goal isn't to undermine public health, it's to make it stronger through integrity, transparency, and the inclusion of all relevant evidence, even the inconvenient parts. So I want this to be a conversation, not a conclusion. If you're a scientist, policymaker, or simply someone curious about how evidence shapes decisions, I'd love your feedback. Please read the preprint, the link is in the notes below, and share your thoughts using the hashtags #TheTransparencyLab, TTL, or Fluoride Debate. Honest, open scientific dialogue is how we make progress. Thank you for listening to the Transparency Lab. In upcoming episodes, we'll explore topics like research transparency, conflicts of interest, and how AI is changing the landscape of scientific review. I'm Dr. Tammie Foster. Remember, transparency builds trust, and trust builds better science. Stay evidence-minded, and I'll see you next time in the Transparency Lab.